Okay, shall we start, Bu Yasmine and Joanna?
Yes,
Okay,
please.
okay. Yep. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon for Joanna. Thank you for attending the guest lecture today. It's about the business and climate change, why and how to achieve the net zero. So we are pleased to have Dr. Joanna Berry here from Durham University Business School, the UK. She will share about the climate change and then like the why do we have to achieve the net zero and then how the business has to involve on that. Okay, before that, let me introduce the Bu Yasmine as moderator and also Joanna as the speaker. So Bu Yasmine, so Dr. Yasmine Nasution, she is currently a lecturer at the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia, in the field of strategic management. She is also a consultant, trainer, and also assessor at Lembaga Management, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. Previously, Bu Yasmine was the executive secretary for the faculty and also the head of development and planning at the faculty. Bu Yasmine did her bachelor degree at the Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. Then she received Master of Applied Commerce from University of Melbourne, Australia. And also she did her doctoral degree at the Faculty of Economics and Business with dissertation topic of entry decision in multi-market competition. And then we have the speaker here, Dr. Joanna Berry. She is an associate professor in the field of entrepreneurship at Durham University Business School, Durham University, UK. She is also the director for business, enterprise, and innovation at Durham Energy Institute. And she also sits on the University COP26 steering group. So the COP26 that is happening right now, I think. She is also the co-program director of the new Master of Energy Systems Management, a joint program run with Durham's engineering department, which launches in September 2021, just this year. She is a pathway leader for the MBA Entrepreneurship Pathway and winner of the Durham University Enhancing Learning and Teaching for the Digital and Online Learning Award 2019-2020. She graduated from Oxford University with law degree and then MBA and PhD from Newcastle University. Her research and teaching interests encompass problem-based learning, energy and renewables, innovation, entrepreneurship, big data, aging and health, and also digital or creative industries. She has a particular emphasis on supporting the woman in STEM agenda in a variety of ways. She works closely with the external relations team and undertakes a wide variety of public and media activities on behalf of the school and university. So with this, I think I'll give the screen to Bu Yasmine to lead the discussion. And then hopefully everyone will enjoy the session and we'll get a lot of knowledge and insights from Bu Yasmine and also from Joanna. So with this, I give the screen to Bu Yasmine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dani. Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Yasmine, and I will be moderating this session. Tonight, as mentioned by Bu Dani, we will have a discussion on climate change and how it will affect our business. So, over the past few decades, corporate sustainability has become a strategic issue for many companies. And they try to find ways on how to reduce companies' negative impacts on society and the planet and to be more responsible in their operation. And climate change is considered the most important issue facing our society today. And I'm happy to welcome Dr. Joanna Berry, who will present the topic of business and climate change, why and how to achieve the net zero. Before we begin, if you have any question during presentation, you can write your question at the chat box, or I will give you the chance to ask directly at the Q&A session after presentation. And to keep the quality of sound during presentation, please keep yourself mute, okay? And now, without further ado, let us welcome our guest lecturer, Dr. Joanna Berry. Joanna, the time is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And what a delight to see so many people. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's lunchtime in my side of the world, over in Durham in the United Kingdom. And it's, I think, the end of the day for a lot of you. So thank you very much for being here at the end of your day, in the middle of my day. And I hope that I hope that you find what I have to say today useful and interesting. I am 2 or 3 things, a little bit of housekeeping. I speak quite fast. We are recording this session, so I'm conscious you can go back and listen to it again. But if you do feel that I'm speaking a little bit too fast, then please do say so in the chat bar, and I'll try and keep an eye on that and slow down. I am also quite happy to take questions at the end, so I look forward to a debate and to a conversation with you. There are a lot of slides to get through, so some of them I will go through quite quickly, but I'm going to share the slide deck at the end of the session with Nurdani and make sure that she gives the slide deck to anybody who is interested to see it afterwards. It's quite a big slide deck. There are a lot of pictures, so it was a little difficult to do that in advance. And also, I would like at the end of this session to take a little picture of everybody. So those of you who are hiding behind your screens, I'm giving you a little warning now. You've got an hour to make yourselves beautiful so that you can switch your videos on at the end and I can take a little snapshot. I like to use LinkedIn, I like to use social media, and it would be superb to have a picture of all of the many people that I'm talking to on an international basis, just to let the world know that we are interested in these things, because really, these are questions and problems that affect the world. And I think it's important that we let the world know that we're all talking about it. All right, so you have an hour to apply your lipstick, take off your pajamas, put on some smart clothes, brush your hair, and get rid of your children and your dogs and your cats and make it look like you're really paying attention, okay? What I'd like to talk about today, and I'm just going to go full screen, okay? I have a number of screens going, so if I'm not looking directly at you, forgive me, but it's the way the screen thing works. Here we go. First of all, this is roughly the agenda. There's an emphasis on a few different things, but we're going to look at first of all, a quick, simple overview of why the climate is changing. Not everybody is up to speed on this, and I thought that it was worth just a quick, 101 climate change class.
Joanna, sorry,
yes?
Joanna, sorry to interrupt. The
yes?
slideshow, it's kind of different. We have two slides. Are you?
Oh, hang on a sec. Display settings, swap presenter. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah,
You got the one.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Right, that's better. So first of all, why the climate is changing, a quick overview. And then I thought we'd look at how the world was being affected, just to make it really clear on why climate change is an important thing from a practical perspective, and look at those populations who are particularly at risk. Thinking about timelines and when maybe we need to think about getting climate change under control. And then importantly, what we as individuals, as businesses, as populations can do about it. But first of all, just a quick introduction. Nurdani, who I know from her time doing her PhD, which was an exceptional PhD, I have to say. She was asked to publish from it, which doesn't always happen. So you're very lucky to have such an exceptional academic in your midst, and particularly an exceptional female academic. I'm very proud of her for that. She did me, I think she did me a favor by covering pretty much everything that is on this slide. I have come from industry into academia, and currently I'm very much enjoying my time doing a little bit of work with the Energy Institute in business innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as having a number of activities in my life working with social enterprise and supporting women in business, as Nurdani said, particularly. You can catch me on Teams, on Zoom, on FaceTime, on WhatsApp, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and my contact details are there. I am going to share these slides, as I said. Some of these slides will go quite quickly. So what is net zero? Why is it important? Net zero, go away, sorry, my slides are. Why is that? No, I don't want to do that. Net zero refers to a state in which greenhouse gases, GHG, going forwards, are when greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere are balanced by their removal from the atmosphere. It is important because this is the state at which global warming stops. I'm sorry, my slides are flying around the place here, okay? Achieving net zero is absolutely necessary to stop global warming at 1.5 degrees. This is an important thing, because if we don't achieve this by 2050, that's when things start to go horribly wrong. The Paris Agreement in 2015 made this a legally binding agreement with a very clear goal: to limit global warming this century to less than 2 degrees and preferably less than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, because it's only when we started to become manufacturing nations that we started to diverge and increase the heat that the planet was emitting. So this is a reduction in the average temperature across the whole planet, and therefore becomes a target that the whole planet is responsible for. Some places have already seen very much more as the Earth starts to warm up. And you will have noticed in the news that there have been excessive heat, excessive wildfires, excessive temperatures, both of cold and of heat, all the way around the world. Compared to pre-industrial temperatures is a very important metric, because all man-made global warming is caused by our use of fossil fuels, of coal, of oil, and of gas. And if you look at this particular metric here, the greenhouse gas chart, you can see from the little red dot that's there in 2018, the annual greenhouse gas index was 1.43. That's an increase of more than 40% since 1990. So the warming influence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has increased substantially over the last decades. The annual greenhouse gas index on the right vertical axis, it's an index of radiative forcing. So normalized to the year 1990, which is represented by that red dot on the right, it shows that the warming influence of long-lived greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has increased by 43% between 1990 and 2018. That's an astonishing amount, 43% increase in greenhouse gas warming between 1990 and 2018. Greenhouse gases trap heat in our atmosphere, and that's what leads to rising global temperatures, the melting of land and sea ice, rising oceans, devastating heat waves, floods, and more. And that's what's led to, for example, the years 2014 through to 2018 being the warmest in modern record, and 18 of the 19 hottest years having occurred since 2001. So the record-breaking heat waves that we had over in Western Europe, in France and the Netherlands, when people died of heat in summer 2019, was made 10 times more likely due to climate change. Is it too late? Well, the increase in global temperature that's now reached 1.1, some places 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We're on target at the moment to pass 1.5 degrees Celsius by the mid-2030s if we do absolutely nothing. Even if we try, we could reach 2.7 degrees by the end of the century, which would have absolutely catastrophic consequences. It doesn't sound like an awful lot. Stopping at 1.5 degrees, not reaching 2 degrees, that half a degree Celsius difference doesn't sound like an awful lot. But that half a degree difference would mean, if we stopped at 1.5, would mean 10 million fewer people losing their homes to rising sea levels. It would prevent some low-lying island countries from disappearing altogether. It would limit the loss of coral reefs, Arctic sea ice, endangered species. It would mean that 50% fewer people around the world would struggle to find fresh water. That half a percentage difference would make an enormous difference. And to reach only 1.5 degrees is still an enormous task. If you think we're at 1.2, some people would say 1.1, but I think 1.2. To reach only 1.5 degrees, we still have a big job to do. We need to halve greenhouse gas emissions over the next decade, 10 years, it's not long. We need to reach net zero emissions by the middle of the century, by 2050. This needs huge, serious changes in the way people and companies act. And I want to show you now some pictures, some graphs. I want to really bring this into a space that gives you some scientific, evidence-based facts so that you can see not just what I think and not just what's being talked about at COP26 up the hill where I live here in Glasgow. I don't live in Glasgow, but it's only a few miles up the road from me in the UK. So let me show you some pictures. This is the Keeling curve. Started in 1958, when they first started measuring carbon dioxide in the Mauna Loa Observatory. It's the longest record of direct measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Keeling was the first to observe that not only does carbon dioxide rise and fall with the seasons, but that despite seasonal fluctuations over spring and summer, autumn and winter, overall levels were rising every year. So they started to measure, and in 1974, there were a separate set of measurements, and it became very, very obvious that carbon dioxide emissions were rising year on year. So as the coalition of 197 nations started to think about meeting the Paris Agreement to decarbonize the global economy by 2050, they had to start to think about the speed and the scale and the cost of that transition required to green all the assets that were necessary. And those are really quite expensive considerations to make, because limiting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees means deploying renewable energy rather than energy that emits CO2 at unprecedented scale. So it's the equivalent of installing the world's largest solar park every day for photovoltaic power alone, according to the International Energy Agency. So you've got to redesign whole areas of the economy. You've got to completely phase out combustion engine vehicles and fossil fuel power plants. You've got to create huge stocks of electric vehicles. You've got to retrofit buildings and homes for energy efficiency, but we can't afford not to. And the cost of the transition is going to be absolutely enormous. The OECD says that it's going to cost roughly the equivalent of 6.9 trillion American dollars in global investment every year till 2030 to meet climate and development objectives. That's a little bit under $1,000 per year for every person on the planet. And that will only go partway to solving the problem, because if you think about it, countries around the world are still trying to sort out the cost of dealing with the COVID pandemic. We were talking about that just before we started this presentation. And the overall costs of a transition to a green economy haven't really yet been considered properly. There's a lot of countries burdened with pre-COVID underinvestment in infrastructure, estimated at something like $3 trillion a year, in addition to repayment of debt post-COVID. And if you add to that the cost of retrofitting infrastructure, replacing fossil fuel related income tax, and providing financial incentives to support investment and research and development for green infrastructure, never mind the whole cost of what's called the just transition, compensating workers who are displaced, reskilling the workforce. There are huge, huge issues that are very, very expensive, all based on this one image of the undeniable increase in CO2 emissions. And these are accurate measurements. There are some people who say that the climate isn't changing. Donald Trump is one of them. He thinks that it's fake news. This is a graph that proves that it is not fake news, right? Model projections match observations. There is absolutely no doubt, there is complete scientific confidence that when climate scientists advise us about the need to take urgent action to address climate change, we really do need to listen and to respond. There is no evidence that climate models systematically overestimate or underestimate warming over the period of their projections. They are pretty generally spot on. This gives you an indication of what temperature and CO2 look like over the last 1,000 years. And as you can see, they've been relatively stable until the last 100 years, when the statistics simply go shooting up. global methane emissions are important to look at because methane traps far more atmospheric heat than carbon dioxide. It only lasts, the effects of methane's global warming only last a few decades, whereas CO2, which remains in the atmosphere for centuries and centuries. But it can methane can warm the planet 86 times as much as CO2 before it decays, and it decays into CO2. Global methane levels have been hitting new highs in recent years. So this is an issue that we've been looking at in a lot of detail. The Durham Energy Institute have been doing a lot of research on this recently. And obviously, because a lot of methane comes from cows, we have rather flippantly maybe been calling our research into methane as opposed to methane. The International Energy Agency estimates that industry can reduce methane emissions by 75%, and that most of those efforts would pay for themselves through the value of the saved gas, because methane released by cows raised for agricultural purposes accounts for 26.9% of total methane emissions. And that's in itself responsible for 9% of the total US greenhouse gas emissions. 9% of greenhouse gas emitted in the States comes from cows. Ocean heat content has continued to increase at surface levels where it can be measured, and that also reflects what is believed to be increasing heat temperatures rising deeper into the ocean. And unfortunately, what this also implies is that the top layers become less dense than the lower layers, and this affects the exchange between the surface and the deep waters. This risks marine organisms, impacts food production. It tends to lead to more frequent occurrence of blooms of algae and thermal expansion that causes sea levels to rise. And warmer oceans also are believed to contribute to the intensity of hurricanes. And this is an alarming graph. You'll have seen this if you've been watching any of the coverage of COP26 as well. This reflects global land and ocean temperature anomalies when you compare them to the 20th century average. The trend toward ever warmer temperatures is very clear and very convincing. And this, according to NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, as you can see at the bottom. This shows that 2019, for example, was the second warmest year since modern record keeping began in 1880, second only to 2016. The past 5 years have been the warmest than any recorded over the last 140 years of record keeping. So why is the climate changing? Well, the use of fossil fuels is one particular area of huge problem, and there is unfortunately a very geographic and very clear issue that this particular graph shows. Coal supplies a third of all energy used worldwide. This is the International Energy Administration. And it makes up 38% of all electricity generation. It also plays obviously a crucial role in industries like iron and steel. The UN panel on climate change is very clear that to stop catastrophic warming, the use of coal as an electricity source has got to drop to between 1% and 7% by 2050, by the middle of the century. But as you can see in this graph, coal demand, whilst it's declining or at least stabilizing in more developed countries, is currently anticipated to rise dramatically in China, who aren't represented by their most senior political individuals at the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, in India, and in Southeast Asia. It dwarfs the impact of coal reductions in other parts of the planet. It's absolutely critical that global efforts are focused to reduce this projected demand through alternative energy sources. Until we can accomplish this, cleaner and more efficient technologies have got to be pursued to minimize the impact of these increased coal-driven fossil fuel emissions and the pollution that they cause. Because there is undeniable evidence that ocean stratification, acidification, and deoxygenation will keep increasing. And the rate at which these things will keep increasing is purely dependent on the future use of fossil fuels. Mountain and polar glaciers are going to keep melting for decades or centuries with very high confidence. Permafrost carbon and permafrost thaw is pretty irreversible. We're going to keep losing ice in the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. And it is virtually certain that the global mean sea level will keep rising over the 21st century. We're going to keep losing low-lying islands. People will keep losing places to live. The sea level is committed to rise for centuries to millennia because deep ocean warming and ice sheet melt are going to keep happening. Because of what has already happened, we can't stop a lot of this. So certain negative impacts to our oceans and our ice sheets are absolutely inevitable. What we can do is stop that trend. Historical increases in the global surface temperatures correlate directly with increases in carbon emissions since the post-industrial age. So we can predict future temperature increases depending on different scenarios, depending on what we as individuals, we as countries, we as the world decide we're going to do now and for the next 3 or 4 decades. In other words, the amount of global warming that's going to be experienced by the planet basically depends on how much carbon we humans continue to choose to emit into the atmosphere. Ocean acidity has increased by 30% over the last 250 years because the CO2 has to go somewhere and a lot of it gets absorbed into the ocean. And so marine species like coral and mollusks and shellfish and plankton are put at risk by the increasing acidification. It literally is eating some of our mollusks and shellfish alive, and it's warming their habitat. Over 50 million people worldwide rely on fish as a vital source of protein, and some areas have seen fish populations decline by as much as 35%, but since just the 1930s up to the early 2000s. If you look at the balance of sources of carbon emissions and the sinks, as they're called, the places where carbon can be absorbed, and carbon can be absorbed into the land, it can be absorbed into the ocean, it can be absorbed into the atmosphere. The imbalance between sources of carbon and sinks for carbon is pretty stable all the way up to round about 1950. And it's only from 1950 that the sources and sinks of carbon emissions start to go out of balance, that post-industrial cutoff point. So sources of carbon emissions include the burning of fossil fuels, changes in land use, deforestation and the melting of permafrost, and emissions that aren't absorbed by sinks like land or the oceans simply remain in the atmosphere and heat it up. And as you can see in this graph, the growing imbalance between sources and sinks and emissions and places to absorb them has resulted in a significant increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases. So deforestation and climate change, as an example, cutting trees adds greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, whilst at the same time removing the ability of the trees to absorb existing carbon emissions. What was really heartening today in COP26 up in Glasgow was that more than 30 financial institutions who together have got more than $8.7 trillion, that's something in the region of 6.4 trillion pounds, British pounds, in assets under management, have made a commitment to tackle deforestation. And in particular, I believe Brazil has made a public commitment. And Brazil is one of the areas where deforestation has been massive. That's very, very heartening because deforestation is an amazingly important and devastating part of climate change. The mass destruction of trees sacrifices the long-term benefits of standing trees for short-term gain. Forests still cover around about 30% of the world's lands area, but they're disappearing at an absolutely shocking rate. Between 1990 and 2016, the world lost 502,000 square miles. That's 1.3 million square kilometers of forest. That's an area bigger than South Africa. Since we started cutting forests down, 46% of trees have been felled. About 17% of the Amazonian rainforest has been destroyed over the last 50 years. And that number's going up. We need trees for lots of reasons, but not the least of that is that they absorb not only the carbon dioxide that we exhale, but also the heat trapping greenhouse gases that we emit. So that's quite an important thing. I liked this. I didn't quite like it, but I thought it was an important graph to show you, or an image to show you. These are global tipping points, and they are all unfortunately interrelated. A tipping point is a threshold at which a change can trigger a cascade of dramatic, unpredictable, and irreversible calamities in the climate. Examples often include the melting of Greenland's ice sheet, causing threatening rises in sea level, or an Arctic thaw that can release large amounts of dangerous methane emissions. There's a lot of uncertainty about the biogeochemical processes that are possibly triggered by climate change. And scientists have shown not only that tipping points exist, but they're also quite difficult to estimate with precision. But they can generate tipping cascades on other biogeochemical processes, as this graph shows. So as you can see, if there are problems with the West Antarctic ice sheet, there are possible tipping point impacts on the Greenland ice sheet, which might then go on to affect the Arctic summer sea ice, which might then go on to affect the alpine glaciers. But the Greenland ice sheet, problems with that might also affect thermohaline circulation, which could affect the Amazon rainforest, which then goes on to affect El Nino, and so on and so forth. We live in an interconnected world, and problems with one area are bound to have a knock-on effect with the rest of it. We don't live in isolation. We as humans are interconnected, and we all are responsible for the whole world. One scary point, and whilst this looks like a bit of a mess of graphs, sadly, they all have exactly the same important overriding principle at their heart. They're all aiming downwards. These are the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. It's a major mechanism for heat redistribution on our planet, and it's an important factor in climate variability and change. It's a sensitive, non-linear system. It's dependent on very subtle density differences in the ocean. And what these graphs all show is that the circulation is slowing down in response to global warming. Basically, what's happening, and this AMOC includes the Gulf Stream, which is hugely influential, is weakening. It's presently in its weakest state for more than 1,000 years. It's a major heat redistribution mechanism, and as this circulation weakens, what's happening is that you see more intense storms, more cold spells, more heat waves, you see global sea rise. And if we can't limit warming, what could happen is a tipping point which throws global climate patterns into disarray. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of some 1,300 scientific experts from countries all over the world under the auspices of the United Nations, concluded that there is a more than 95% probability that it is human activities over the past 50 years that have warmed our planet. So if you look at this graph, it compares global surface temperature changes, which is the red line, and the sun's energy that the Earth receives, the yellow line. And it basically shows that the amount of solar energy that the Earth receives has followed the sun's natural 11-year cycle of little ups and downs, with no net increase since the 1950s. But over the same period, global temperature has risen markedly. It's not the sun causing the world to warm, it's us. And model simulations basically show that if we keep going the way that we are, we will end up with an enormous decline in Arctic sea ice that, if you look at it from the top down, looks like this. Current Arctic conditions show an Arctic ice cap that is significant and projected Arctic conditions that are almost entirely gone. That Arctic sea ice has melted, gone into the sea, and obviously what that means is that the sea levels are going to rise significantly. So this is by the latter part of the 21st century. The ice sheets of Antarctica that have been melting at a rate that's tripled since 2007 result therefore in a contribution to sea level rise that will cause a 6-inch rise, they reckon, to global sea levels by the end of this century. And a 6-inch sea rise is huge when you live by the sea. It looks a little bit like this. An additional rise of maybe 1 to 4 feet is likely, and up to 8 feet by the year sort of 2100 or so. Sea levels are going to be higher than the global average for the US eastern and the Gulf coasts. These graphs show the deviation from mean summer temperatures from around about the 1950s to the early 2000s. The green dotted line is the average temperature range in summer from 1950 to 1980, the base measurement period. So what's significant here is that these warming shifts occurred during the lifetime of your typical baby boomer. We've all experienced these more extreme hot days. Looking at land-based ice melt, coming back to, I think this slide is slightly out of kilter, but increasing temperatures have caused melting of mountain glaciers, small ice caps, the Greenland ice sheet. It's a hugely important factor, especially if you live on an island or on one of the many islands surrounding the many of you people who are living over in Indonesia. So who's at risk? Let's talk a little bit about that. We're sort of halfway through here, a little bit further than halfway through, I think. For many thousands of years, most humans have lived in parts of the globe where the mean average temperature, the MAT, was between 55 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit, and agricultural and livestock production was limited into a similar sort of range of temperatures. It was just a comfortable temperature to live at. Assuming populations gravitate to these conditions and carbon emissions continue at current levels, rising global temperatures mean that mass human migration in the coming decades, without which about 1/3 of the global population is projected to experience a mean average temperature currently found in only about 8% of the Earth's land surface. So if you look at these maps, they show suitability areas for current and projected temperature scenarios. This map at the bottom here shows the areas that, if you base them on historical patterns, aren't going to be desirable for human habitation. So if you look at these red spaces in the bottom map, in that map C, the map areas that are in the brightest red colors are simply going to be too hot for comfortable human habitation, for agricultural and for livestock production. So if you look at the numbers in 2017, it's estimated that something like 18 million people across the globe were displaced, forcibly displaced, within their own countries because of floods, storms, drought, wildfires. All of these disasters have been made worse by the changing climate. So families and communities that have already started to suffer from disasters and the consequences of climate change that's forced them to leave home in search of a new beginning is something that we have to consider. Climate and environmental degradation and natural disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee movement. So if you look at these statistics, and I think this is actually possibly a little bit on the fuzzy side, I might have to get a slightly cleaner version of this graph for you. There are a significant number of what I'm calling climate refugees who will simply have to move from where they are in order to ensure that they can live a life at all, never mind a comfortable life, because of the impact of climate change. Climate change threatens the object of sustainably eradicating poverty. Poor people and poor countries are exposed and vulnerable to all types of climate-related shocks. Without well-informed, rapid policies and programs, climate change could result in an additional 100 million people living in extreme poverty by 2030, because poor people and poor countries are exposed. Natural disasters that destroy assets and livelihoods, waterborne diseases and pests that become more prevalent during heat waves and floods and droughts, crop failure from reduced rainfall, spikes in food prices that follow extreme weather events. Poor people suffer more. And then you look at maybe the more developed world. There are still many urban and suburban areas that experience elevated temperatures compared to the rural surroundings. The difference in temperature is what constitutes what we call an urban heat island. Elevated temperatures can affect a community's environment and quality of life. Some heat island impacts might seem positive, they lengthen the plant growing season maybe, but most impacts are negative. Increased consumption of energy, elevated emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases, compromised human health, impaired water quality. So even people living in relative comfort in cities still have compromised quality of life. So when can we hope to get climate change under control? Let's talk about what we can start to do about it. Well, 90% of clean energy is feasible. We have to build new wind and solar generation activities. We have to start to look at natural gas and wind and solar expansion. It's challenging, but it's feasible. New renewable resources are possible. We can start to look at battery storage and solar and wind. We can start to look at reducing carbon emissions from a higher scenario to a lower scenario with a combination of technologies and policies. So in this example, these emission reduction wedges could include increasing the energy efficiency of appliances and vehicles and buildings and electronics and energy generation, reducing carbon emissions from fossil fuels by switching to lower carbon fuels, or capturing and storing carbon, switching to renewable and non-carbon emitting sources of energy, including solar and wind, wave, biomass, tidal, geothermal. I mean, these are just illustrative, but they're all possibilities. All is not quite lost. Electric vehicles are, some people think, in particularly developing or developed world, the key to, or a key to rapidly decarbonizing transportation sectors. Electric vehicle technology dates back to the beginning of the 1900s, but recent advances in battery cost and performance and in vehicle range and recharging, along with a proliferation of different types of models from car makers and a rapid expansion of vehicle charging situations and networks, that's starting to get them ready to overtake gas and diesel vehicles as a more dominant or potentially more dominant on-road technology based on economics. And the price of electric vehicle batteries is going down as well. And particularly, electric vehicles don't produce tailpipe emissions, so their efficiency slashes greenhouse gas emissions, and overall emissions start to disappear as they're charged with increasingly carbon-free electricity. So they're positioned to produce individual and national and global benefits the more we can get towards that sort of space. And although COVID-19 has caused a bit of a dramatic drop in fossil fuel emissions for 2020, that reduction is a little bit less dramatic than we'd like to think that it could have been. The pandemic has created other obstacles to immediate plans to address climate change, because of course drops to emission tied to the virus could be short-lived, while the continuing drop in oil prices could encourage more consumption and hurt demand for low or no carbon products like electric vehicles. But it's Still hope that the renewable industry will continue its rapid forward movement only after a bit of a brief setback. Renewable energy was the only sector to record a slight increase in demand during the pandemic. And there are a few studies around that show that more jobs can be created from supporting renewable energy investment than fossil fuels. The financial sector is taking notice of climate change, which is good to see, and its potential impacts on global economies. Central banks are starting to think about ways to avoid financially disruptive risks, such as those arising from climate change, but it's difficult to find new tools to address the risk, especially because traditional accounting and economic performance measurements don't distinguish between natural capital, natural ecosystems, air, land, soil, water, and human-created capital like machines and buildings. So accounting frameworks at the moment assume that a loss of natural capital can be offset by an increase in manufactured capital. There are proponents of an alternative, strong sustainability approach, as this slide shows, that argue that existing stocks of natural capital and the flow of ecosystem services that they provide have to be maintained because their loss can't be compensated by an increase in manufactured or human capital. So for example, the depletion of natural capital in a warming world can't be compensated by higher income. In this view, the economy is embedded in social and biophysical systems. It's not a separate entity, as the traditional approach to sustainable development is framed. The more money a household has, the more average tons of carbon dioxide equivalent it emits per year. The more wealthy you are, the more of an emitter you happen to be. Everything you eat, every time you drive, everything you wear, you add to total global emissions. The typical American's annual per capita carbon footprint is well over 5 times the world's per capita average. And a household's carbon footprint generally increases with its income. So it's important to note that wealthy consumers with more than $100,000 worth of annual household income accounted for 22.3% of the total population, but are responsible for nearly a third of households' total carbon footprint in the States. But they can afford to have a conscience. And one of those things that maybe they can do is start to eat a little bit less meat. Decreasing the amount of meat we eat, especially red meat, could cut in half the per capita greenhouse gas emissions relating to agriculture. Switching from beef to other sources of protein could cause global greenhouse gas emissions to fall by 25% and reduce diet-related deaths by 5%, which is not a bad thing. It would also help to avoid further deforestation, and we've talked a lot about deforestation already, and reduce the amount of water used for agricultural purposes, which could have a significant effect. In the States, 80% of water used is for agricultural purposes, and the amount needed for meat production is significantly more than that needed for plant production. One of the things that absolutely stunned me when I was doing my research for this particular presentation was this slide, which I thought was quite shocking. If food loss and waste were its own country, it would be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter. The greenhouse gas emissions attributable to the production and distribution and disposal of our planet's food is significant. Just bearing this in mind, if you don't think of anything else at the end of this presentation today, would be a good thing in my book. If you only remember this when you go home. And there's a huge cultural problem here as well, isn't there? Because obviously in Asian countries, to leave food behind has a completely different meaning to in a Western culture. You know, there is significant cultural difference to eating up all your food or leaving food behind, dependent on the country and the culture that you're in. There is also a bit of an issue with the sort of throwaway culture that, particularly in Western Europe, seems to exist. the throwaway culture and its destructive impact on the planet and on global warming and climate change. We do need to recognize the need for a change of lifestyle in production and consumption. Overconsumption has a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions. 60 to 80% of environmental impacts could be said to come from just that buy and throw away sort of consumption habit that we've developed in Western Europe. Global fossil fuel subsidies totaled $544 billion about a decade ago, compared to only $101 billion for renewables. Fossil fuel subsidies for 2015 were $5.3 trillion. So that's an amount equal to about 6.5% of global GDP. More than 40% of this represents subsidies for coal, which is the most environmentally damaging of all fuels, as we've said, of all fossil fuels. That's not necessarily good news on its face, but the disproportionate funding for fossil fuels represents an opportunity to shift funding from that to renewable energy without an overall increase in costs, which I think is quite a hopeful sign. We've talked a bit as well about electric vehicles. Technological progress has also facilitated electrification of trucks and buses and other vehicles. In 2019, electric vehicles avoided the consumption of almost about 0.6 million barrels of oil products a day. And the electricity generated to supply those vehicles emitted about half of what would have been required for an equivalent fleet of internal combustion engine vehicles. Net emission reductions from electric vehicles would be even greater with the implementation of policies like those that were set forth in the Paris Agreement, because the result would be more rapid decarbonisation of electricity generation. So electric vehicles again comes to the fore as an obvious way in which business and individuals can help address this agenda. And electric and clean energy technologies are becoming less and less costly. The 4 transformational technologies, land-based wind power, silicon photovoltaic solar modules, light-emitting diodes in electric vehicles are becoming less expensive. Dramatic reductions in costs are driving a bit of a surge in consumer and industrial and commercial adoption for these clean energy technologies. The average cost of solar power has been declining over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, and the costs of onshore wind power have equally been going down. It's projected that renewable energy will by 2040 represent something like 40% of the world's electricity by 2040. Looking at renewable energy generation by fuel type by 2040, there is hope here. In 2018, 28% of global electricity was generated by renewable energy sources. 96%, most of it, produced from hydropower, wind and solar technologies. It's projected that renewables will collectively increase to 49% of global electricity generation by 2050. And it's expected that solar's share of generation will grow the fastest and hydroelectric's share to grow the slowest. Interestingly, looking at air conditioning, I thought that was something that was probably worth looking at in a little more depth. There's a cold crunch coming around the corner. By 2050, it is expected that something like 2/3 of the world households could have an air conditioner. We're looking at global warming here, okay? So I thought it was worth looking at how we would all feel like we wanted to cool down. China, India, and Indonesia will together account for about half the total number. Air conditioners and electric fans account for about 20% of the total electricity used by buildings around the world. And as we continue to warm up and third world countries in particular continue to develop, demands for cooling are going to dramatically increase, more than tripling by 2050. It's equivalent to the amount of electricity used by all of India and China today. So the growing use of air conditioners in homes and offices around the world will be one of the top drivers of global electricity demand over the next 3 decades. But the International Energy Agency believes that investments in efficient air conditioners can significantly reduce future cooling energy demands. Growing demand for air conditioners is a critical blind spot in the energy debate, however, and setting higher efficiency standards for cooling is going to be, I think, one of the easiest steps that governments can take to reduce the need for new power plants and cut emissions and reduce costs at the same time. It's an important area and a little bit of a blind spot. If the world's getting hotter, how are we going to cool down? And should we be using such an energy intensive piece of equipment to do so? So by the mid-century, renewable energy is projected to double as a source of electricity, rising from 19% to 38%, some say, of total electricity generation. Coal as a source of electricity, we hope, is going to reduce by almost half. Nuclear energy sources are also expected to decline significantly. Natural gas is expected to remain as a roughly steady source of electricity over this period, representing a little over a third of total energy production. But sustainable agriculture has the ability through adaptation and mitigation to respond to the extreme weather events that climate change brings. Climate change is having profound consequences on our diversity and our diversity of life and on people's lives. Oceans might be warming, sea levels are rising, and there is a bit of an existential threat for dozens of small island states, longer, more intense droughts that threaten freshwater supplies and crops and endanger efforts to feed a growing world population. So the changing climate can compromise food production in countries and regions that are already food insecure, and can affect food availability by reducing productivity of crops and livestock and fisheries, and preventing access to food by disrupting the livelihoods of millions of rural people who depend on agriculture for their incomes. So agriculture has a major role to play in responding to climate change. And sustainable agriculture and innovations in sustainable agriculture, and we've already got issues around vertical agriculture and hydroponics and lots of other clever ideas and ways in which agriculture can address these issues that are coming out of universities and collaborations with universities that are well worth investigating, has the ability to respond to these extreme weather events. There is also a role for carbon dioxide removal, as well as emitting less of it. How do we remove carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide? CDR, carbon dioxide removal. It refers to a cluster of technologies and practices and approaches that remove and sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Apart from the common denominator of actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the technologies can be very, very different. There are biological options and there are engineered options, to put it very simply. For some of the former, like afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon management, there's been decades of experience in these places, but the latter, there's a limited experience. Direct air capture, bioenergy combined with carbon dioxide capture and storage. Carbon dioxide removal options have become a common feature in climate change mitigation scenarios that are consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Carbon dioxide removal and the deployment of negative emissions approaches have got to be employed in addition to other mitigation options. This figure shows emission reductions from conventional mitigation technologies combined with carbon dioxide removal. So this particular image is consistent with an at least 66% chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. There are many plagues of climate change. We've looked at quite a few of them in this very, very whistle-stop tour of what the problems are and what we might do about them. There's sea level, coral reefs, conflict, extinction, there's iniquity, there is disease, there are hurricanes. There are many, many plagues, but the effects of climate change are very far-reaching and they affect every single one of us. global warming is an essential element of climate change, but there are other significant impacts, as we've discussed: heat waves, melting ice caps, rising and acidified oceans, and increased risk of drought and famine and fires and storms, and detrimental impacts to human health. I hope that what I've done is give you a little bit of a run through what net zero is and why it's important to reach it, the personal, professional, political, and business impacts of climate change, and some of the things that I think can be done about it. And I am more than happy to have a conversation with anybody who wants to have a conversation about it. If there was an answer to the many questions that this situation poses, then I wouldn't be here, I'd be out there celebrating. But I'll try and answer any questions that anybody might have.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. Thank you very much for very inspiring insight on this climate change and how it will impact our life. Yeah, it's very interesting. And I learned so many things about this. I think we have to continuously increase the awareness of this issue, and also how this issue is very important for us. And I think this will involve a very massive global level of change management program. Do you think it's in every level of society? Because it's not only the combination of technology and policy, like you mentioned, but I think it's also involving like everyone awareness and lifestyle. Okay, so it should be self-conscious about this issue, because if we look at the slides, we can consider ourselves as a contributor to this.
I think so. I know it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because when you think, well, it's a problem that affects the whole world. How can I, as an individual, how can I move the dial? You know, what difference is it going to make if I just switch off a light? What difference is it going to make if I you know, recycle my rubbish? How can I, as one person, make any difference? How can I, as one business, make any difference? But if everybody said that, then we would all be lost. And I think as an individual, or as an individual business, I think we have to remember that we are all individually and collectively responsible. It's a very difficult mindset to make, when, particularly for the last year and a half, when we've all been so isolated because of the pandemic. We've all been locked in our rooms. And in a strange way, the last year and a half, we've all been so separate from the rest of the world that to suddenly feel responsible for the rest of the world feels even more difficult, doesn't it? It's very difficult.
Okay, Joanna, we already have some question here from Iresti and also Rehan. The first one, Iresti. Budani, can we unmute Iresti so that she can ask the question directly?
Yeah.
Let me.
Iresti, could you raise your raise hand so we can identify you? Okay.
Oh,
there's Iresti. I see. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Yasmine. Hi, Joanna. It's my pleasure to have a chance for discussion about this wonderful topic. And I want to ask your opinion about because you just mentioned about the sustainable agriculture, but I see an issue about that, because sometimes we sacrifice our forests to open the land for agriculture, and it is impacted on we lose our forest, thus we lose a lot of number of the trees, and I believe we need the trees to reduce the global warming. So how do you see about that issue? Because because it's quite a dilemma for me, I think. Which one is important? But I believe the forest is more important, but we cannot live without the agriculture. How do
Yes.
you see about this issue?
Yes, it's a very good question. Now, I am no expert in agriculture, okay, so please don't go telling any farmers what I'm saying here. But so your question is basically, if you have a piece of land and it's currently got trees on it, but you need food and you can't eat trees, so you need to chop the trees down to grow corn or wheat or barley or oats so that you can feed your family. How do you balance those two things? And I think that the solution to the problem is maybe not as simple as that. I think that there is a need for a country, a region, to have a policy about a percentage of their country, a percentage of their region that needs to be kept safe as forests. So my comment about Brazil was to the point. Brazil, I believe, has just guaranteed that it will keep a percentage of Brazil, because a percentage of its country, it will retain that percentage as rainforest and stop deforestation so that the rainforest can recover. And therefore, anything outside that percentage of the country, of the country that is outside that percentage can be used in order to be turned over to agriculture. But that percentage of the country is going to be kept safe, is going to be sacrosanct. So it will not be allowed to be cut down. Okay, I think it has to happen at a government level, and I think it has to be a matter of percentages rather than this field I need to feed my family. Yeah, so I think it has to happen at scale rather than at the level of one field for a family. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think it had that question has to happen at a policy level rather than at an individual level. I'm looking at so many different screens here, so forgive me. I can see your face there and I can see your face there. So I'm not sure if I'm talking to the right screen, but yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answers.
That's my pleasure.
Thank
you for your question.
So it's about at the government level, and it's about how to balance between these two issues, right, Joanna?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, the next one from Rehan. Rehan, could you raise your hand so we can unmute for you? Okay, this is Rehan. I think this will involve the last comment that you mentioned about the pandemic. Rehan, please. Rehan?
We lost him?
No, I think he's still here. Rehan, could you hear me? Rehan? Okay, maybe I'll just read you the question. So I want to ask you about your opinion on how this pandemic affected the progress of Sustainable Development Goals in Indonesia. Is this pandemic make it faster or slower towards SDG? That's the question.
Can you say that again? Ask about the
how this pandemic affected the progress of Sustainable Development Goals in Indonesia. How the pandemic relate to this Sustainable Development Goals, or perhaps how this pandemic, like you mentioned before, how this pandemic will influence this issue, climate change issue.
Okay, because there's a lot of sustainable development goals. Okay, there's I forget now how many there are. There's 17 of them. I'm not sure I remember all of them in order, so I'm not sure I can answer that question specifically for each sustainable development goal. But I think the pandemic has been an interesting time, really. I think it's given, it has made people very much more conscious of the value of society. I think the pandemic has made me certainly much more conscious of the value of my friendship group. It's only when something is taken away from you that you realize how much you miss it, isn't it? You know, and particularly in reference to the conversation that we've been, or the presentation that I've been doing over the course of the last hour or so. When you look at climate change and you look at the nature of the pandemic, you become very much more conscious of the world in which you live when you are forbidden to go out and participate in it. You suddenly realize that, you know, to be able to go out into the sunshine, and to be able to go out into the wind, and to be able to go out and feel the sun on your face and see the stars. And when you're told you can't go out of your house, you suddenly realize how important the world is. So I think the global pandemic, certainly for me and a lot of my friends that I have spoken to over the last year and a half or so, has made us much more conscious of how much we value the planet we live in. I think that, and I know this might sound a little superficial, and I don't mean to be superficial at all, but for me and the people that I have spoken to, the one thing that kept a lot of us sane and stable over the course of the pandemic was being able to go out. If you had a dog, we were only allowed to go out of our houses if we had a dog to walk. So we used to walk our dog. People used to steal my dog. They used to say, can I please take your dog out for a walk? Because it was the only reason they were allowed out of their house. Or if they had a garden, if you could go out, you could go into your garden and you could do some gardening. Connecting with nature, connecting with nature in those two ways were the only reasons that you were allowed out of your house for many, many months when you were locked down. If you were living in, you know, the 4th or 5th floor or the 6th or 7th floor of a block of flats and you weren't allowed out for a long, long time, it must have been, I was very lucky. I have a garden and a dog. You know, it suddenly you were separated from the world in a very distressing way, and in a way that affected a lot of people's mental health. So I think that the pandemic has made people very much more conscious of the value of a healthy planet in many different ways. For me, those two particular ways, but for other people, possibly in other ways. But equally, what happened across the course of the pandemic was things like this: opportunities for me to be in Indonesia, to reach out to, you know, how many pages now? 4 pages full of little squares of people that I'm talking to has become commonplace. And all of a sudden I can reach people and people can reach me in a way that is now perfectly normal, that would 2 years ago have been absolutely bonkers. Nobody would have thought that this was a normal thing to do on a Wednesday lunchtime, whereas now it is. And we're having conversations with people across the world about issues that affect the world in a way that we would never have done 2 or 3 years ago. And that's so that's got to be a very good thing. So whilst that may not answer the question in any intellectually rigorous or deep and meaningful scientific way, that's my personal opinion. I think there is a big downside, mental health significantly affected, but my little patch of the world, I loved my dog and I loved my garden, and I got very much closer to both of them. And yet I reached out into a broader, wider world than I ever would have done because of the pandemic. I hope that answers the question. I don't know whether it did.
Okay. Rehan cannot open the mic, so I hope it answered your question, Rehan. We can move to the next one. Fahmi, could you raise your hand so we can unmute you? Fahmi, yes. Budani, did you say Fahmi?
Yep. Yeah.
Fahmi. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Bu Yasmine, for the opportunity. Good afternoon to you, Miss Joanna.
Hello.
Since it's still the middle of the day there, right?
Yes.
I want to ask you a question about something that my friend mentioned to me. It was something called the Jevons paradox, where the paradox explains how energy efficiency could result in the overall consumption of energy. You know, in your presentation, it's clearly said that one of the efforts to reduce global emission is to increase energy efficiency, right? So how do we control the demand for energy? Because according to this paradox, our efforts of decreasing our efforts of increasing energy efficiency, there's a chance that this could backfire, and this could lead to overall increase in energy consumption. So what are the efforts to control the demand of energy? Thank you.
Okay, so the Jevons, yeah, the Jevons effect. I mean, it was about coal, wasn't it, originally? But I mean, it applies to anything when government policy, when government basically saying that you know, if government policy increases the efficiency that a resource is used, basically reducing the amount necessary for any one use, with the rate of consumption of the resource rises because people decide that, because government have said, they then demand increases. It's a difficult one, and it is a paradox, unfortunately, because environmentalists assume that efficiency gains will reduce the amount of consumption because there is efficiency built into the system, but people just use more of it. So it is difficult. And it's an old paradox. You'd think we'd have got used to it by now. You'd have thought that we'd have found a way around it. And it is, you know, the size of the rebound is something that's been bothering economists for quite a while now. Some people propose that you couple the efficiency gains with conservation policies so that you keep the cost the same or higher to try and stop people from using more of it. Yeah, so like you cap it or you tax it, or you do something about that sort of rebound effect. But sadly, it's human nature, isn't it? You know, if you find that something is more efficient, you just do more of it because it's more efficient. It's a little bit. You find the same thing, I am told, with low-calorie sweeties. If you give somebody a box of low-calorie sweeties, they think, hurrah, they're low calories. So they eat huge amounts of them until they've eaten all of the low-calorie sweeties. The problem being that low-calorie sweeties usually have a sweetener in them that really upsets your stomach. It's not a good effect, but that is, it's human nature. Unfortunately, we are greedy people. And if there is efficiency built into the system, we just use more until we hit that efficiency level. It's an interesting question. I wish there was an answer to it, but it's a very interesting question. Thank you for it. I wish there was an answer. I don't think there is.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Joanna.
Okay, thank you, Fahmi, for the question. Okay, the next one, Aditya Chandra Pamarta. Could you raise your hand so we can identify you? Okay, Udani, could you unmute Aditya?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Yasmine, for the opportunity, and good afternoon, Ms. Joanna. I would like to ask about electric vehicles. How effective do you think about the usage of electric vehicles to kind of reducing the amount of carbon emission? Because as we know, the power and the electricity that power those cars comes from power plants that use coals, that use coals.
It's a good question, but not all electricity comes from coal. Some electricity can come from nuclear power plants, it can come from gas power plants, it can come from hydrogen, it can come from solar, it can come from wind. You know, electricity can be generated from many different places. At the moment, coal is a significant generator of electricity, but this is one of the big challenges. How do we replace coal in the generation of electricity by renewable fuels? Yeah, so you can generate electricity in lots of ways. It's a matter of finding the most efficient and effective way to replace coal in electricity generation. Solar panels and wind and wave and gas and geothermal, there are many different ways of doing it, and this is our big job right now, is to find as many different ways as we can to replace coal and other fossil fuels. Great question though, it's a really good question. You know, it's a little bit like cloud computing. You know, people always say, well, cloud computing, it's great, it's in the cloud, it's all free, but actually making a computing cloud is really energy intensive, because you're using huge numbers of servers that generate huge amounts of heat. It's really not a green way of storing data at all.
Okay.
So yes, it's a very good assumption to challenge. Very good assumption to challenge. Thank you, Aditya.
There's always another side of coin, right, Joanna?
Yeah,
The
always
higher
is.
technology, there's always
And there is no such thing as a silly question. You should always challenge assumptions. Always challenge assumptions.
Okay. So Adit?
Joanna.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Richard. Richard, could you raise your hand? Okay.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, thank you, Bu Yasmine, and thank you, Dr. Joanna, for your presentation and your insight. I'm particularly interested in deforestation. I'm a big fan of nature, and I believe that Indonesia has beautiful nature, but unfortunately, I think we kind of ruin it. So, how do you think we as a student can do to fix this issue? Do you think we should start by simply with awareness, or we can do something more?
Everybody has a voice, and there are, I don't know how many voices on this particular call. Let me just have a little look. Okay, so there's 155 voices on this call. 155 voices make quite a noise. That's quite a good place to start. So you can start a petition, you can start a club, you can start, well, I was going to say start a zoo, but you don't really want to start a zoo. You know, but every individual person that has an interest in this sort of thing has a voice. You should vote if you have the opportunity to vote. You can join your local societies or clubs. I'm sure that there is a student union of some description. If it's anything like in the UK, there will be student societies. There will be organizations and places that you can go where there are discussions and conversations, where you can reach out into those organizations that make policy, that decide what happens to the forests, what happens to the animals, what happens to the, who makes the decisions on deforestation. And honestly, right now, if there was ever a time, now is the time. Brazil, having just decided that it is going to stop deforesting, that's an enormous piece of history that's being made just there. Absolutely enormous piece of history, because if ever there was a country that was devastating the deforestation landscape, that it was Brazil, and they have made a very public declaration that they are going to stop. So now is the time to start to, you know, to join that piece, to join that conversation, and to keep that piece of momentum going. And I don't know your country as well as Nurdani and Yasmine do, but I'm sure that they would guide you to the people and the places, the societies, the conversations, the groups, the communities, the committees that you could join, where your voice could join with other people's voices, because you only need 2 or 3 voices together to make a song, you know, and those songs get heard. So find out, make a noise.
Thank you. That was
right.
a very interesting answer. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I will look out for Richard William on the news in a few years' time. You know?
Hopefully I'll be able
Saving
to.
animals and the forest.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, actually, Joanna, our faculty already, our university actually have a very focus on this green issue around the climate change, and we already put the solar panel in every faculty.
Excellent, excellent, well done. That's brilliant, brilliant. And if you have, I don't know whether you have a society, whether you have a committee or a group or a you know, a focal point for discussions and conversations around these issues, but if you do, then I advise and I would encourage everybody and anybody who's interested to join it, because these are important conversations. To be honest, not so much for those people who are here, but for their children, because it's their children who will either benefit or suffer from what we do.
Yes, that's right. Because the impact is not only the short term, but the long term impact that will be very dangerous.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, any other question? You can just raise your hand if you want to ask directly.
Don't forget, you've got to get your lipstick on, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. I'm going to take a picture soon.
Joanna, can I ask you one thing?
Yes,
this is about the corporate sustainability. Okay, yes. You mentioned the sustainability in your slide, the sustainability approach, yes. And the strong sustainability approach is about the system is embedded in social and ecological system. But some people still say that we have to balance the profit, people, and environment. But if I see your slide regarding the strong sustainability approach, do you think the opinion about balancing those three is a bit, we can challenge that opinion, so we can say that we have to put more emphasis and priority to environment and social rather than profit? Do you think so?
That's it. It's a really interesting question. I think for business, I'll add a slide before I send it over. For business, I think that you really have got to accept that business is driven by profit. It's driven by finance, not necessarily profit. Not every business needs to make a profit. It might be a social enterprise. It might, value for a business may be reinvestment into the business rather than dividends and shareholder profit. But that triple bottom line, we call it, so that contribution to people, profit, and planet, I think that's the three-legged stool, right? We call it a little three-legged stool. And if you take one of the legs away, the stool falls over, right? I think you need those three legs. I'm trying to get the camera right. There you go. You need those three legs on your stool, because if you take one of the legs away, two legs on a stool, and it just falls over and you can't sit on it. You need to look after people, you need to look after your planet, and you need to look after your profits. The balance of those three is up to you as a business. But I accept that you need all three. I think the balance for each business will be different. So if you're Coca-Cola, maybe you need to focus a little bit more on the profits. And in doing so, you have to look after the people and the planet. Whereas if you're a social enterprise, you're looking after your people and your planet. And as in doing so, you have to make money in order to look after those two. Yeah. But I have a slide that I'll add to the slide deck that sort of, there's a picture. You can see I like pictures. So I'll add a slide on that just so that it's there in the slide deck for you. But it's a very good point. And I think the answer is it's different for every business, but I think you have to have all three. I don't think you can get away with two anymore.
Okay, and this is climate change issue is also mentioned in the G20 summit, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
All the leaders, if I read at the news, they reach
except for Russia.
Oh, except for, but there's still a debate.
Putin doesn't believe in it, I don't think.
There's still a debate related regarding the time limit. Is it right?
Well, the deadline that all of the research tells us is that we have to try to aim for 1.5 by 2050, as in we have to try to restrict global heating to 1.5 by 2050. At the very latest and at the very most. So at the latest 2050, at the most 1.5. That's all the science is telling us that. So, India has said 2070, which is not enough, but at least they're trying. So I guess at least they put a deadline. And Russia hasn't said anything, China haven't sent the premier, or the whatever China's leader is, premier, prime minister, principal, I can't even remember their name, forgive me. Anyhow, they have sent a negotiator, but the negotiator isn't doing any public negotiating so far as I can see. And China and Russia are hugely important, hugely influential, and massive emitters of greenhouse gas. So it is deeply depressing that they have decided not to play. It's like kids in the playground. They've just decided that they're too big and they're not interested and they don't want to play, because of course, if they commit to a reduction in emission of greenhouse gas, it would affect their profits, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
It's, but they will die. And their children will die, just like we will die, and our children will die if they don't do something about it. It really is that stark. The land will sink into the sea, and the temperature will rise, and the felt will burn, and the ice will melt. Just the same for them. It doesn't just not happen in Russia because they don't come to the table.
Yeah.
I fail to understand what they don't understand about that. You know, they're sticking their fingers in their ears, closing their eyes and singing a song. It's childish, deeply childish.
Yeah. Okay,
Dare I say it, the fact that both countries are run by men might have something to do with it, but that's just me.
Okay.
Sorry, gentlemen that are listening. I apologize. Please don't take that personally, but honestly.
Okay. Joanna, we have another question here from
Yeah, sure.
Aulia. Aulia, could you raise your hand? Okay, Budani.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your opportunity, Ms. Yasmine. And good afternoon, Dr. Joanna, and good evening, everyone. I would like to ask a simple question about coal. So, as the lecturer mentioned about coal, like we know that there's a huge increase of coal usage, and coal is directly contributed into to the global warming and the temperature change because it causes the greenhouse gases. And we see that actually there are a lot of efforts from developed countries to move to another sustainable energy such as wind or sunlight in a massive scale. But I wanted to ask, in your opinion, what should the coal importing country like Indonesia should do in order to cope with this kind of issue? Because maybe in the long run, the usage of coal won't, the usage or the demand of coal won't be as much as today, and we need to catch up with the developed countries. Thank you.
You do. You know what you've got lots of that I really like? You've got lots of sunshine.
Yeah.
You've got huge amounts of sunshine. I'm looking out of the window, it's pouring with rain. And no, Dani, you remember what Durham's like in the rain. Yeah, it's miserable, horrible when it's wet. You have sunshine, you have wind, you have waves, you have lots of sources of energy. Collaborate with universities that are working in research in these areas, collaborate with companies that are producing solar power, wind power, wave power, collaborate with companies that are doing this sort of thing. I bet you anything, if you said to somebody, come and do a little bit of a research exploration in Indonesia, you'd be beating them off with a stick. Honestly, work with people, reach out to people, say, we don't want to use coal, we'd like to work in renewable energy, and reach out to people and say, please come and work with us and help us. And you would have, come and talk to the Durham Energy Institute. Find those people that are currently looking at importing coal and find out who it is you need to talk to replace that. And again, I'm sure that Yasmine and Nurdani would be able to help you identify those people in the universities who are working in these spaces and collaborate with people outside of your country, with people who would like to help you find sources of renewable energy that you can work with, that you have masses of. You have lots and lots of sunshine, you have huge amounts of coastline, you have lots and lots of wind, you have lots and lots of wave power. You have lots of sources of renewable energy that are just sitting waiting to be used. Use it. Let us help you use it.
Thank you for your insight, Doctor. It's very helpful.
It's all right.
Okay. Thank you, Aulia. Fahmi, you raise your hand. Do you want to add on that issue?
Yes, actually, very interesting question from Aulia, but I'm just wondering, as Aulia said, Indonesia is one of the biggest coal importing countries in terms of coal volume, but we are shifting. I believe we are trying to shift to better renewable energy in Indonesia, but I believe our coal resources is still massive. It's still very I would say I'm sorry, I lost the word. It's still precious. It's still very precious for us, coal as a natural resource. So what should we do with it? I mean, should we just ignore coal, the natural resource, or should we just stop mining them? Or what can we do with it without harming the environment, I would say.
I wouldn't suggest you sort of stop immediately. There's a phased process of activity that you would need to undergo. I think a recognition that it needs to stop being used and an opening of doors to new and renewable energy sources from now is just an important process to start. Because the more coal you use, the more you're damaging the planet for your children. It's as simple as that. So whilst I appreciate that you've got it, it's not precious, it's poison. It really isn't precious. I'm sure it's worth a lot of money, but that money is pointless if you don't have anywhere to spend it because you've killed the planet.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanna.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of strategy policy regarding this renewable energy in Indonesia. But again, it's we still have a lot of issue like I mentioned before, how to balance between the profit, people and planet, how to increase the awareness of the society itself, and also for the business community and everything. So there's a lot of things to do regarding this issue.
There is, and it won't happen at once, and it won't happen immediately, and it won't happen overnight. But as long as there is a consciousness that it needs to happen, I think that's the important thing, really, you know.
Okay. One last question from me, Joanna. In your opinion, which country do you think already has the highest awareness of this issue?
Oh, wow. Gosh, that's a difficult question. That's a very difficult question, Yasmine. I mean, it's all over the UK at the moment just because we're hosting COP26, which is, you know, the climate change conference. So I would suggest that probably in terms of not being able to get away from these things on the TV, it's everywhere. It's in every newspaper, it's on every TV station, it's on every radio station, it's absolutely everywhere. So I'd probably have to say the UK at the moment, but that's just because we're hosting the conference. What will be interesting is how long that lasts, you know, and how long it takes before that's displaced by
another issue,
football, or somebody getting lost and getting found again, or somebody dying, or something happening in the royal family, or, you know, it's people's memories are very short, but this issue is very, very long. And it's very immediate. And, you know, 2050 seems such a long time to think ahead about. I won't even begin to tell you how old I'll be in 2050. I'd like to think I'll still be around, but I might not. But I have a son who's 21. It's really important to him.
Yeah.
Really important to him. And that's why I am involved in this set of conversations, because it's for him. I want his planet to be, I want him to be able to live in his planet. I want him to be able to visit Indonesia and not to suddenly realize that, I'm sorry, I used to know some people in Indonesia, but it's underwater now. You know? Yeah, and that's sadly what I could have to say to him, because there's a lot of islands. How many islands are you in Indonesia? 100 and...
Yeah, thousands.
Thousands of them. Half of your islands could be underwater by the time that travel restrictions are lifted and we get back to normal life, you know. So I want him to be able to go to the places that are so beautiful, that have the beautiful forests, that have the beautiful animals. I don't want the animals to be extinct. I don't want the islands to be underwater. I want him to see the world in all its beauty. I don't want it to be too hot, too cold, too dry, too dead.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Okay. Oh, Aditya mentioned 70,500.
17,500 islands. Wow. Wow. Well, there's a lifetime ambition to visit every single one of those islands.
I haven't visited all of them. I don't think I will be able to.
No, but what a wonderful ambition to try. Hey? My very best friend Desi is from Jakarta, and I'd just love to get to Jakarta one day and visit her and her family. You know, I would love to. So, and Danny, of course. Okay. Right, I need to take this picture. Yes. Is everybody taken their pajamas off and put some nice clothes on? Does everybody brush their hair and clean their teeth?
I think so. Everyone is ready.
Beautiful faces. Let me take some pictures.
because you already mentioned it at the beginning, so I think everyone
I
is
gave
ready.
everybody plenty of time. I gave everyone time to put, you can have your little screen filters on, you can have little ears and halos and all that stuff if you want to. Thank you very much. I appreciate you doing this, but it's so nice to see proper faces and everything. Do your hair. Everybody look beautiful. All right, I have 4 screens, so I'm going to go, I've got 3 screens, so I'm going to go from screen 1, screen 2, screen 3.
Danny also is going to take the picture. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to take as well.
All right, we have
But
Michael
I have
and
6.
Ivana and Ratna who aren't
Danny have
showing
6.
up, but we should wait for them.
Yeah, but I have 6
maybe they just
screens.
don't want to show. Okay. Is everybody smiling?
Joanna has bigger monitor.
I might have a bigger monitor. Okay, I have screen 1. And I have screen 2. Wow. Look at all these happy smiling faces. Brilliant. Excellent. Right, I am a happy person.
Okay, Joanna, thank you again for answering all the questions and also for the presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us. I hope we can have a chance to meet again in the future.
I would love to. I would love to. It was lovely to see everybody's happy smiling faces. Thank you so much for being there. Good evening to everybody who is still awake and listening. I hope you got what you wanted from it. I hope it ticked the box for you, and take care of yourselves. Take care, stay well, be happy. Okay.
Okay, thank you
again.
So students, this is concludes our guest lecture session for tonight. Thank you for your attending and active participation. I hope you learn and enjoy the session. It was a pleasure being with you all tonight. And now for the closing, I will return the session to MC. Over to you, Ibu Dani. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bu Yasmine, and also thank you, Joanna, for the lecture, for all the presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Bu Yasmine, for leading the session, and also thank you for students and everyone who's participating. Thank you for joining us tonight. Hopefully, yeah, you've learned something and you remember something from the lecture. Yeah, hopefully we can see you again sometimes in the future. And also, Joanna, hope to see you again in like offline setting. Hope to visit Durham again later.
I hope so.
Yeah, thank you. So with this, I conclude the guest lecture. So we'll see you again in the future. So thank you. Have a good evening. Also for Joanna, have a good
Thank you.
day. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.